Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Kilty. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Mike, we had a lot of fun in our last episode all about data interpretation, sort of research-based passages. We introduced a very, very nice 4-step system for dissecting any research figure that you might see on the MCAT. If you don't know what we're talking about, go check it out in our last episode. And I'm excited to build on that with our topic today.
Right. Yeah, I love how we get on these like tracks, like these mindsets where it's like a few episodes a week ago we did the whole genetics, right? Kind of the whole genetics path. Now we're kind of this on the little psych-soc binge. And really now that we're on data, we talked about how to actually interpret it, but now we're going to be talking about types of research that we're going to be checking out in today. Because all the time in these, especially psych-soc passages, but really every science section, they love throwing experiments at us. And not only is it important to interpret the data of the experiment, but it's also important to understand what's the type of research that they're actually doing, what's actually generating the data. Because a lot of the times they're going to be asking questions, like more so in psych-soc, but I've seen them in chem-phys and bio too, where they ask things that you can only answer by understanding the type of research they're doing. So I'm excited today because this is something that's applicable. Anything that's applicable across all the sections, I love chatting about, but this is going to be more, oriented towards psych-soc inevitably.
Yeah. And just as a heads up, in case anyone is starting, maybe you're testing in January or maybe in February or something pretty soon, if you start to take some AAMC questions or you're taking an exam or two, you'll notice they have skill labels. Skill 4 is your data interpretation. That's what we talked about last episode. This episode is all skill 3. It's reasoning about the design and execution of research. It's like, how was the study conducted? What kind of study was it? Are there any biases you might expect, right? Like what were the variables, things like that. In that realm though, and these skills show up across all science sections, how they show up is very different, like you said. And in most cases in chemistry and physics and in bio and biochem, it's all like pretty direct from the methodology, right? Or it's asking for a variable or something like that. Why did they choose to measure this thing? In psych-soc though, you get very different question types. So it's going to be exciting. We will hit on how this applies to our chem-phys section and our biochem section. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of nuance to add in psych-soc that is really just, it's very rarely taught formally. You're just kind of expected to learn it along the way. And there are actually quite a few like buzzwords or vocab terms that we do need to learn in order to analyze this. So it should be pretty fun. And I feel like there's one major distinction that we should be making when it comes to like what is pretty like ubiquitous, pretty much every single study you see in chem-phys and biochem, they're all experiments, right?
Right.
They're all experiments. Psych-soc, they may be experiments and they may not be. Still research, but not experiments. Mike, what the heck am I talking about?
We're like, what are you talking about? We're talking about the distinction between experimental studies and observational studies or observational research. Now, it's really important to understand what are the common traits of these researchers, because especially in psych-soc, there's a common kind of question that they ask that I love talking about, but in order to understand how to answer that question, you need to understand these two question types. So let's start with, I think this, especially those of us with more of like a pre-med background, more of a sciencey background, we kind of lean ourselves more to the experimental studies, the experimental research. So in experimental research, this is kind of your classical, like, we manipulated some independent variables. We added this antibiotic. At different concentrations to see the growth of the bacteria, where we have an independent variable and a dependent variable, where the independent variable is the one that we are actually manipulating. We, the experimenters, are actually changing who gets what. They are deciding who gets what. This bacteria gets X amount of concentration. This bacteria gets X amount. It's the experimenters themselves who decide who gets what. And then they measure the dependent variable as a result. In this way, we are able to establish causality. we are able to say and conclude, hey, this independent variable did or did not lead to this dependent variable, right? These are the kind of researches that, like, yeah, we want to see, does this antibiotic kill that bacteria or not? Let's go experiment that kind of deal. And this is kind of, I think, the most powerful form of research because you can conclude causality, right? And you can control things like randomization, right? You can control who gets what. You don't have these situations where you have this bias, like, oh, only these people had this kind of independent variable, these groups. You're able to randomize who gets what because it's the experimenter that decides, right? And we're also able to include control groups, right? So that who don't get that independent variable to see what goes on, right? Because you have so much control over the variables in the experiment, you're able to conclude these things. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm like, Molly, like, why don't we just do everything experimental? Why doesn't just everything experimental? Because it sounds great. It sounds like a great experiment type.
Yeah. And obviously, like if you can control things, you might as well do it, right? There's this trade-off that we have of like, if we want to understand causality, like a cause and effect relationship, if I make this change, then this must change. Like if they are that clear and clear cut, that sounds awesome. We could take action on something like that. That's that black and white, that cut and dry. That being said, in order to establish causality and really trust it, as you've been hitting on, what you need is pretty complete control over the environment. Okay. Like if you were doing a experiment on, let's say, lab rats, how much, maybe you changed how much running on the wheel time they were given and you were measuring their body weight or something like that, right? Obviously, that's a pretty simplistic experiment, but right, you would want to make sure that those lab rats, right, had the same amount of food because that could mess with the results of your experiment. It could be a confounding variable if it's not controlled for. You'd want to make sure that they have the same body temperature, or not body temperature, cage temperature. You could measure body temperature too and keep that consistent, right? If you can measure and control for all other variables that could potentially influence things like body weight, then you could say, oh, okay, running on the wheel is the literal only difference between these different mice in their exposures. And so, we could say, okay, this amount of exercise creates this change in body weight. If you cannot control the system, you can't really establish causality. And there are times that you can't control, like most human subjects research.
Right,
okay. And
right.
to your question earlier, why don't we just do this all the time? It's because we, as psychologists, let's say, have very little control over other human beings. Like there's a huge question of ethics here. If I could just grab a bunch of adults and throw them in like a total compound where they were all living in like little cages and I could pick how much food to give everyone and I could control for literally everything. You could do experiments, but also that sounds horrible and
awful.
unethical. Like you should not do that, right? You can't do it. You can't, especially if you are, it creates a whole lot of major ethical questions. And so it poses the need in especially human subjects research for another kind of research, which is I'm accepting that I really have no control, right? Let's say that I'm trying to understand the relationship between school class size and grades. Okay. You could set up an experiment, right? You could do your best with that. But ultimately there are a lot of other variables that may influence your grades. What is your sleep quality, right? What's your at-home life? Are you able to complete assignments, right? If you can start to control for things like that, cool. You can establish greater confidence. There are some things though that you just can't. Okay. And we'll talk about some examples of research that they would have to be observational.
Right.
But one of the most prevalent that comes to mind for me is, it's actually one that's in the section bank. It's an idea where they wanted to study cocaine exposure in pregnant females. You obviously cannot conduct an experiment of, okay, I'm going to recruit a a group of 40 pregnant females, and I will tell at random 20 of them to ingest cocaine and the other are not, let me measure what happens to that fetus when it is born. Like, you could never do that, right? Your best bet is to recruit people who currently are pregnant that are not using cocaine and recruit people that are using cocaine, right? Because you can't make that decision. And ultimately, even in both of those cases, there's a million other variables that could impact fetal development in these individuals, and you really can't control for it. Okay, so in observational studies, you do the best with what you can, but you have to accept that you are never going to be able to find cut and dry cause and effect relationships because there are so many uncontrolled variables. And so, you do a lot of surveys, you do a lot of interviewing, you do a lot of, you can measure as well, but again, you can never really determine causality the way that you do in experiments because you lack control. Really, the best things that we can do is find associations or correlations between some sort of exposure, which is analogous to a cause, and then some sort of outcome, right? Two things that are associated, but maybe not in a cause and effect relationship in a true sense.
Right. Yeah, and these observational studies, like they really hit on that like ethical part where, you still have independent variables. Like, just because we're not doing experiment doesn't mean there's still not independent dependent variables. Absolutely. There's still the independent variable, like in the example that you did, where cocaine exposure versus not cocaine exposure, still the dependent variable, child outcome. But the big thing is we did not choose who was exposed to cocaine and who was not exposed to cocaine because the experimenter did not choose, right? It is observational. And because of all of these things, because there's so much you can't control, we cannot conclusively say cocaine caused this. We could say cocaine maybe did this, cocaine might have done that, even if there was associated with this, but we cannot say, like, so say they, in that experiment, they see with a high level of confidence, like, oh, those people had cocaine exposure, the babies, I remember the passage, I don't even remember the outcome of that passage, right? Oh, babies had like major learning disabilities later on in life in that group. We can say cocaine might impact learning disabilities or might be associated with learning, but we cannot say that cocaine caused those children to do that because this was not an experimental study. And it's this distinction that's hit on so many times in questions. All the time. I love this question type, which is along the times they have some observational research in the passage and then they ask, based on figure 2, what can we conclude from the study? And then there's like 4 answer options. 2 of them are like sometimes just throwaway ones, but there's one that says, "Oh, cocaine causes learning disabilities," and another one that says, "Okay, cocaine might be associated with this." And everyone chooses A because like, "Oh yeah, that's what I saw. That's what it led to." But because they didn't realize, wait a minute, this is an observational study, so you cannot choose an answer option that is conclusive. I can't tell you how many times students come to me like, "Mike, this is what was shown in the data." We're like, "Is this an experimental study that you can conclude?"
Yes.
No.
And this is, it comes back to our training. Many of us come from bio and chem or even physics backgrounds, like the quote unquote hard sciences. Like we've probably been in lab many, many times. We conducted our own experiments. Not as many of us MCAT students have conducted psych experiments that might have been observational, right? We're not as used to that study type. And even within psych, and we'll give you a couple examples in a little bit, there are experiments. You can do experiments in psych, right? But because we lack familiarity, we gravitate towards experimental language, like the cause and the effect, right? So you're totally right. It's a very important distinction to make. And that's what really makes the difference in those skill 3 questions. Like,
Absolutely.
can you assign it? And I want to clarify, psych soc is where we see both, or we can see both. Chem phys, biochem, you don't need to do an observational
Usually,
study.
like it's very rare. I hesitate always to say never because I know
Yes.
I mean, exams are always, developing and
I
maybe we'll
can't
talk about that
think
later.
of how you could
Right.
do
Yeah,
it.
they could get creative, but like for the most
Mhm.
part, like I'll just say 99 just to leave ourselves some
Yeah.
liability room. 99% is going to be experimental studies.
Yeah. There
Yeah.
you go. Yeah. Because it's easier, it's easier to control for, especially in organic things. There's
Oh yeah.
not quite as many ethical considerations. And if it's a something that could be done in a test tube, it's
Yeah.
very easy to control for different variables, right? Especially, even if you have 20 trials, you have 20 test tubes, that test tube rat could fit in, you could expose it to the same conditions in a very easy way.
Right.
You don't have the ethical considerations of human beings, and you can't, just stick human beings in giant test tube racks and just keep them next to each other for
not
God knows how long, right? You couldn't do that. So it's
Yeah.
much easier to do experiments in other
Right.
sciences.
Amazing.
But yeah, pretty cool stuff. And because I think so many of us are pretty comfortable with the basics of experiments, you want to make sure you control for anything that you are not either manipulating or measuring. So independent or dependent variables, respectively. You can, right? The goal, at least, is to determine a cause-effect relationship. And again, control becomes a big part of that. Because we're mostly comfortable with that, I think we should really expand on observational studies, because this is what's going to feel new to a lot of people. And I think in this description, there are many different types of observational studies. And I kind of want to go through just a couple different options for how we could label studies like this.
Sure.
Okay. The first major distinction that we're going to see, and I'm going to use exposure and outcome to basically describe the independent and dependent variable, right? It's usually the language that you'll see in this context. There's the first major distinction in types of observational learning is, are we measuring over a long period of time, right? Differences in the or, are we looking forward in time? Are we looking backward in time? What are we starting with? And also, are we studying this group of individuals or this situation for a long time? Or are we measuring everything at once and essentially creating like a snapshot of a population at a given time? If it's a snapshot and you are basically measuring the outcome and the exposure at the same time, right? You're collecting all your data in one go, one survey, and your data is collected and you're done. That's what we call cross-sectional research. Okay, you snap your fingers, it's done. Okay, all your data is in one single data collection day or method. Okay, you can't really figure out any sort of cause and effect there. I know cause and effect in general, we can't, but you're not spreading this out. There's no time course. It's all at once. This is very different from a longitudinal study, which is done over a period of time. That could be a year, it could be 10 years, it could be, I was going to say 100 years. Probably not.
I think there's actually some studies that are going right now that have been going. They're like, those are very, very rare. I'm like, one's coming to mind right now. I think about like they follow like all the people at birth and they're like 80 or something right now. And so there's stuff like that, but
totally
very rare.
Yeah. And so longitudinal studies, you are looking at a period of time. You are following individuals for a while. I think that is really the first major distinction. Okay. Right. How long of a time frame do we have data collection taking place? Right. And then again, also, are we identifying people who have an exposure of interest and then following them forward in time to figure out the outcome? Or are we identifying an outcome of interest and are we going back in time to figure out, okay, well, what were you maybe exposed to, right? So forward in time is a prospective study. Backwards in time is a retrospective study. I think those are like the general terminology that we could throw around when describing the very specific types of observational studies. So these are more like labels, longitudinal, cross-sectional.
More and more specific, right? You kind of overarching experimental observational, and then, okay, what kind? Okay, it's cross-sectional, longitudinal. But then we also have, again, focusing on those observational studies, even more specific kind of observational, like longitudinal observational studies, which really focus on where did we start? I think you put it really wonderfully where it's like, are we starting at the potential cause and saying, what's the outcome? Or are we starting at the outcome and seeing what could be the potential cause? And so I kind of like to start, let's start with the situation where we have this outcome. Let's say, for example, like a disease, right? Or maybe an illness, right? We start with like, hey, there's a patient with illness X, right? And we've recruited this patient and this may be a new disease, but like we want to figure out what this person what happened to this person for them to have illness X. So we compared this person who has illness X, and we compare another person who doesn't have illness X. And then we look back to see within both of their lives, see, hey, what could have happened to this person to have them have illness X that maybe the person who doesn't have illness X didn't get exposed to. This is a kind of study known as a case control study. And the example I gave is a retrospective case control study. Most of them are retrospective because we normally go into the past, where we started out the outcome. We started, hey, do you have this disease or this illness? What caused this thing in the back? We look to the past to see, was it a genetic? We look at their genetics. Is there a genetic cause? Was there an environmental cause? Was this illness X person exposed to some environment that maybe normal control person wasn't exposed to, that kind of deal? We're looking back to figure out the cause to an already established outcome. This is the idea of a case control studies. This is in contrast to what's called a cohort study. Now, a cohort study, you are not starting at the outcome. You are starting at the cause. You are starting at some exposure to something and seeing, hey, what is the outcome? And cohort studies really lean themselves both to retrospective cohort studies and prospective cohort studies. So an example of a retrospective cohort study would be maybe 30 years ago, there was a town that was exposed to some sort of a oil spill, or they were around a factory of some sort. That was the cause, like 30 years ago was the cause. So we looked back at the cause to see, okay, where are they today? What is the effect today? So we started at the cause and looked at the outcome today. Whereas a prospective study would be, hey, these people, these X amount of people were exposed to something today. Let's follow them along in the future to see what the outcome is. In both of those cases, for the cohort studies, you're starting at the cause and are observing what will be the effect, in contrast to a case control study, where you are starting out the outcome and are trying to figure out the cause. Both of them longitudinal, but it's like, where are you starting? It's like the big distinguishing that I feel like people kind of like, oh my gosh, what's the difference? It's where you start. That's the big difference.
Yes. So case control, cohort, and I love that you're applying the other like more general language, right? These are all, for the most part, longitudinal. They could be prospective, they could be retrospective. Again, those are like labels that we could use. These are actual types of research, observational studies. There's one more that gets brought up a lot, right? And of course, we could break observational research into so many different types of studies, but really these are the main ones for the MCAT. The other one that's really cool is what's called a case study. Okay. And usually when we talk about cohort studies or case control studies, we recruit ideally a large group of people that all share a common exposure or a common outcome, depending on what kind of study it is. With the case study, these tend to be individual people, or maybe a very small group of people that have something abnormal or rare going on. And it's like, okay, this is something that is not happening to many people, but looking and studying this person gives us an opportunity to learn a lot about something specific that we're curious about. Okay. And in this case, there are many individualized examples that we talk about in Psych. There are people that have taught us so much about, especially the brain. And I just, I feel like we should give a couple examples of different types of studies.
Some have come up in the past in previous episodes too. Yeah.
Yes. And I feel like we kind of got to give examples here. There's this individual, Henry Mollison, or HM, who was suffering from essentially seizures. And they, in the past, were like, hey, let's figure out how to make this better, right? They basically scooped out his hippocampus and were like, great, let's see what happens.
Solved.
Yeah, so this is, and I want to be super clear, a lot of the case studies, especially done far in the past, there were a lot of people, especially in early psych research or like neurological or neurobiological research, that they just kind of messed around with the brain and saw what happened. HM is a good example, right? They scooped out his hippocampus to see if that would help his seizures. And ultimately they were like, oh, weird. This guy can't form any new memories.
Oops, my bad.
Oops. HM actually was followed for many, many, many years. And most of what we understand about the hippocampus in long-term memory and even procedural memories, very interesting, because he actually was able to develop some procedural memories, just not long-term semantic or episodic memories, which if you're curious, we'll talk about. We talked about memory and different types of memory. But we learned so much from studying HM. And we have, I think, more data points on HM than like anybody else in the world. We followed him for so long. And again, taught us so much about how the brain works and how memory works. There was even an individual, I can't remember what decade he lived in. It was a while ago. This individual, Phineas Gage, who had a sharp object basically impaled in his head, but didn't die. He actually survived. It went straight through his frontal lobe, and his entire personality changed. His entire personality changed, and he had very little impulse control, right? Which obviously affected his personality, but also studying Phineas Gage gave us, again, a lot of very unique information. Again, we are hopefully, fingers crossed, never going to go around and scoop out someone's hippocampus for fun or to, experiment. And hopefully we will never also purposefully impale people in the head with sharp objects. But because this is such a rare situation, studying these individuals in a very in-depth, often qualitative or like long form way can help us really understand and form hypotheses about how things apply in other situations, right? I will say those findings are not always the most applicable to everybody else because it is such a specific rare situation that's going on. And yet they really can help advance our understanding of, again, especially how the brain works, but also even, how the body works or how development works, etc. So case studies, I think, are particularly interesting because by their very nature, they are a unique case. And again, we tend to record a lot of data about these individuals.
Right. And it can give us insights that lead to further research down the line. And that's kind of how I always I remember somebody asked me like, oh, if experimental research is so good, why do we even do observational research, like ethics aside? Where a lot of times we actually do observational research to just say like, is this even worth studying? Like, is there even something there that maybe later we could do maybe something more experimental down the line? So like in drug trials, for example, like that's how a lot of times it starts with something observational and then down the line they lead to something more experimental. And case studies, kind of like you noted, can be both retrospective and prospective. Like a lot of the ones that you stated right now, we found them, we're like, oh my goodness, hole through the frontal lobe. That's awful. Let's follow you along for the next 20 years to see what happens, kind of deal. So you can see it's over a period of time, prospective, longitudinal, observational. A lot of these specific study designs we can pull away. And this is a lot of times is how they're going to ask these sorts of questions in psych-social passages, right? Where they present a study and they're like, was this longitudinal? Was this observational? Or it'll be, what was the study design? It'll be like observational. Was it longitudinal? These sorts of things. We need to be able to like figure out, see the situation and say, what specific tags can we put on the study? What kind of research was it? There's a lot of other experiments that were really, really cool kind of in the past. Again, a lot of them very ethically ambiguous because again, a lot of them in the past. So like a big one that many people probably have heard about is like the Milgram shock experiment, where they kind of told people to, every time that the person did not comply to shock them and they had increasing loudness and they kept on shocking. That one caused a lot of like really traumatic experiences. So not okay today at all. But it's one where that they subjected some people to it and some people not to it, and they saw what would happen. Experimental study, not ideal.
Shouldn't be an experiment.
Yeah.
Please don't conduct that. I can only imagine how that must feel. The whole idea was the participants are supposed to administer increasing shocks to people because they failed to do some little task. And they're told that's just another research participant that's sitting in a literal shock chair.
Yeah.
And you're just supposed to keep turning up the shocks and delivering shocks because they can't answer a question or they can't perform a simple task. And the question is, are you going to stop delivering shocks at some point, or
Right.
are you just going to follow orders?
Yeah, it was a whole thing about like some
Crazy.
authority figure was like telling them, "Oh, keep on going, just keep on going." It wasn't an actual person that was getting shocked. They were like had them have, and
It
it was
was
like
fake.
some like
Yeah.
yeah, it was like a oh, what's it called when it's like somebody in on the study?
It's
I can't like
uh,
an actor, but there's a term for it. I can't remember off the top of my head right now.
oh,
But
it's on
yeah.
the tip of my
I know,
tongue.
I know. But anyway, yeah, it was like some actor that's involved in the study, and so nobody was actually getting shocked, but because it had such impacts on the person, because they like it made them like, oh my goodness, am I like a good person? Am I a bad person? It was really related to like World War II stuff, and we're not going to dive into that, but like, yeah, it's very much like, will people say, do things that are atrocious just because some authority figure told them to? Very psychologically interesting. Actuality, really really awful. But there are other experiments that were done in the past, that again, ethically ambiguous. Like we've talked about it, and Molly, very dear to Molly's heart, is little Albert.
Oh,
Yeah, no.
don't you
If,
bring up little Albert.
there was also the
No.
Bobo doll experiment with kids and aggression. We talked about that in observational learning, as well as the Asch's conformity experiment, where they asked people like in a group, like, hey, like they showed a group of people like two lines. One was obviously longer than the other, and
It's a
then they had people.
Confederate. It's a Confederate.
That's the
That's
word.
what
I was like, why can't I remember the word? A Confederate.
it
So
was going to bother me. Okay.
yeah.
It's a
So
Confederate. That's someone who's in on it. They're
mhm,
they're role playing as participants, but they're not.
right.
They're actually part of the study design.
Right, thank you. That
They're
was bothering
actors.
me. Yeah,
Yes.
so
Okay.
actors are
That's going to
Confederates.
bother me.
But yeah, so like in the Ashes experiment where they had a whole bunch of Confederates, I can use the term now, right? And then one person participant, and they showed them all two lines. One was obviously longer than the other, and they asked them all, okay, which line's longer? Then all the Confederates, the actors, would say, oh, the shorter line was longer, and they wanted to see would the participant pick like the obvious wrong answer just to go along with the group. And a lot of times they did, even though it was obviously wrong, which was some very interesting research. But again, all these experiments, ones that are very important for the MCAT to understand, like concepts and how we study these concepts, are very applicable to our conversation. We can classify, oh, was this experimental? Was this observational? Was this longitudinal? Was it more cross-sectional? So like the Asch's conformity experiment, they didn't really follow those people over a period of time. So that's more of a cross-sectional study. They're not like checking, hey, 10 years from now, are you going to do the same thing? They weren't really doing that. They were just saying, right now, what did you do? And that's it. Kind of more of a snapshot.
Yeah.
Mm.
And also, recognizing when you're trying to figure out, is this an observational study or is this an experiment? Ask yourself, am I assigning people to a particular, am I manipulating their life directly? Right. An
Mhm.
observational study, you're not manipulating anything, right? You're recruiting, you can measure stuff,
Mhm.
right? But you have no control over what that person does. Okay. You're just watching and learning. That's it. Okay. So it's like observational learning in observational study. You're just watching versus in an experiment, you're rolling up your sleeves and you are tinkering with the world around you in some way or another. So when we think about these experiments that were done, right? These are experiments because we assigned people to participate in a certain group and then we changed what was going on with them. Okay, we directly interfered in their life. We assigned them to do something instead of just, we're recruiting you because you're already doing something, and then we're just going to sit back and watch. So it's
Mhm.
how active are we in this process, right? Are we actively creating changes in the lives or experiences of our participants or not, right? Are we a passive observer? Or are we tinkering, for lack of a better word?
Mhm.
Um, so something good to keep in mind. That really is the main distinguishing characteristic for you to look for if you are trying to answer a question. Can I say this is cause and effect? Is this an experiment? Is it an observational study? If it's observational, what other kind of labels and vocab can I use to describe it based on the specific setup? And I want to be super clear. Most of this is going to be tested through examples and application.
Mhm.
Okay. You're very rarely going to get like a direct content question, right? Like it's going to give you a study type and then you are expected to analyze it and decide how best to label it. Um, I will say quick plug for a free resource. For a while, and it's actually a resource that I made a very long time ago, but we do have a flashcard deck with a lot of these terms that I had made probably like 3 years ago. It's on our website. It's called the Psych Research Methods Deck. We could link it here. If you want to get some practice with these types of studies, if you want to see some examples provided as well, those are all on those flashcards. We also have a free digital textbook, and we will link that as well. We have a whole chapter on this stuff. I think one of the hardest parts about this, like this type of question that's like critiquing or evaluating research and how it was conducted, is the fact that it's so rarely formally taught. So if you're feeling like, oh, wow, this discussion seems really high yield, which it is for Psych Soc especially, but for the other sections as well, if you want additional clarification, we have a flashcard deck that will help you. And we also have a free digital textbook that has a lot of information here if you want to dive in a little bit deeper or see more examples for any of these, because there are a lot.
Tons of examples, right? You'll find those all if you're on YouTube. It'll all be in the description. And yeah, and also they're all found on our website, so you can go to jackwestin.com to check all that out. And so now we've covered so we've covered the different types of research. We've covered, okay, is it longitudinal? What do we classify it as? What are the different types of research? We've covered some examples. But now we can talk about, okay, when we're carrying out the research, we want to be able to make sure that what we're actually researching, like, we're not making mistakes per se. We're not allowing any sort of doubt in our research, right? When we're going, just because you've gone and done an experiment, you've determined independent, you've found your dependent variables and you did something, doesn't mean your research is actually correct per se. There are kind of these levels of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like levels of things that we want to make sure that the research is doing in order to make sure that we can actually draw conclusions, or there's no issues with the research that could affect what things we can draw. And so there's kind of two things we look at for research, right? Is this either valid research and is it reliable research, right? So let's talk about validity first. And when talking about validity, there's kind of two types of validity. There's internal validity and external validity. In internal validity, what we are asking is, hey, does this research, especially for experimental studies, actually determine a cause and effect relationships? Can you actually link what you are doing, your independent variable, to your dependent variable? Can you actually make that conclusion from your research? And so maybe the researcher said, hey, let's go back to the rat example. Hey, we said going on a wheel actually causes weight loss. Maybe that is your statement, but maybe you didn't control what the rats ate. Maybe you let some rats eat a lot of cheese and some rats ate, lettuce the whole time, right? And so in that case, I would not, like, anyone looking be like, no, like, you didn't control for the cheese versus the lettuce. What if it wasn't the fact that they were on the wheel? What if it was the fact that they were just eating lettuce the whole time? And so in that way, my ability to draw a relationship between cause and effect is lacking because I didn't control for those other variables. So therefore, my study lacks internal validity. I cannot actually establish a cause and effect relationships. Versus external validity. External validity is maybe I'm able in my study to determine cause and effect. I did the whole rat thing. But then maybe I am trying to make this conclusion about humans. I'm saying, hey, exercise leads to weight loss. I'm like, well, you actually did the study on rats. So would I be able to say that about humans? I would not be, right? I can't say that conclusively. And so external validity is any problem where I cannot generalize my research. I cannot bring it to the external population outside. But a pretty extreme example with the rats to humans. But you could do this in other situations. So in a situation where if you want to do a study on like heart health for people over 60, but then you only got people from your local gym, right? You've got a little bit of an issue where, oh, hey, I don't know if you can generalize that to everybody because of your sample, who you chose to actually participate in your study. And so in this way, you can lack internal validity if you can't establish cause and effect because of confounding variables, or you could lack external validity because because of who you chose in your study, you can't generalize it to the rest of the population that you want to claim is doing that.
Yes. So validity is all about how accurately the study did what it was supposed to do. Okay. Internal validity is within the study itself. Was I being accurate? Like, was I measuring what I think I was measuring? Like, can I trust the actual data collection? Can I trust the study itself? External validity is this finding accurate outside of the experiment, right? So validity is accuracy, right? Internal is within the actual experiment. External is this accurate to everybody? Yes or no? That also is called generalizability, like you said, but it's a term that you may see individually. So something good to keep in mind. So when we talk about accuracy, it's, again, am I measuring what I think I'm measuring? Validity, accuracy, more or less synonymous for the context that we're talking about them with. Now, on the other side of things, where we're not really evaluating the true, for lack of a better word, accuracy, am I measuring what I think I am? We also have reliability, okay? Reliability, what we're evaluating there is when I'm measuring things, is that measurement pretty consistent? Like if I measure the same thing multiple times, am I going to get the same result? Okay. Reliability is also described as precision. Are my results precise? Again, if I measured the exact same thing multiple times, would I get the same result? For example, if you had an unreliable scale, for example, if you stood on the scale, maybe it says, 180 pounds, right? Or however many kilograms you want to do if you're in Canada.
No, it's a funny thing. We in Canada still use pounds, actually. That's the one
Oh.
part of the metric system that we actually don't, we talk about our weight in pounds. Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
For anyone who's listening to this for the first time, I am from America. Mike is Canadian.
Yes.
We always are like, wait, what temperature is that in
What
Celsius?
temperature? Oh, when you say Fahrenheit, it blows my mind. I'm like, I have no idea. Like, is that hot? Is that cold? Please put it in Celsius. Like, I generally
Yeah,
have no idea.
that is super interesting. Okay, so for all of Americans and Canadians out there, we all connect with this. If you step on a scale and let's say it says 180 pounds or 130 pounds or 250 pounds, who knows? If you step on the scale and that's what it says, and then you step off, and then you immediately step back on, and maybe it originally said 180 and now it says 140. Could you really could you
What am
really
I?
trust that? Like that's it's a different question, right? It's not like, oh, maybe I'm trying to evaluate, let's say, body fat percentage, and I'm actually using a scale. It's like, does that really answer the question that you think you're answering? I don't know. That would be questionably valid. But here, if I'm literally just using a measurement tool and I use it a couple times and I get different results, that's not a question of validity. It's a question of reliability. Okay. Again, how precise are my results? So if I repeat it, would I get the same results? Now, I think we both like to use the visual representation of a dartboard. This visual is shown everywhere.
Everywhere.
Okay. So if we're talking accuracy or validity, the question is on a dartboard, if you pictured each of the results as a dart, right? You know, a dartboard has like a series of concentric circles. The closer you get to the middle, the better, right? The higher the points if you're playing darts. But if you have something that's very accurate, right, it should be at least on average, if you took at the average of all the results, centered around the middle. Okay. It should be close to the bullseye because that's telling you, again, I'm more confident in I'm measuring what I think I'm measuring. I'm getting a true, accurate representation of what is really going on. Reliability or precision is how clustered, how close are all of my data points. You can have something that is precise and yet invalid, right? All your data points are super clustered, but it's like so
Way
far
off
away from
center.
the actual bullseye that it's obviously invalid, but or it's not accurate to what you were trying to go for. But your measurement is precise at least.
Right. I can think of actually a pretty good example of that. Like with your scale example, imagine you had like a weight scale that was like constantly weighing 20 pounds heavier, right?
Oh,
Every
yeah.
time you say I'm like 180 pounds, and then every time I jump on my scale, like the scale says 200, right? It's wrong. But if I stepped off the scale and then went back on the scale, it'll still say 200. It's wrong. It's not very accurate, but it's very precise. Like the precision is good, right? Where it's like every single time it's consistent, it's just wrong. So you can have high reliability with low validity. I remember I got this question once, like, can you have high validity with low reliability? I don't actually think you can. Like, can't think of a single scenario where you have high validity and low reliability, because that means you're getting a whole bunch of different numbers. Like, how can you be valid in that? I can't think of a single case. I mean, maybe you can think of one, but honestly, I honestly can't think of a single case where you have high validity and low reliability. I can think of the other way around.
I'm trying to think about it, and a lot of the examples that I could think about are more on the observational side of things. Like people are fickle. Like if you
Yeah.
thought of like, you know, the first thing that came to mind was like if someone was reporting, let's say like their emotional state.
Mhm.
Like it could be it could be measuring the same thing every time. It's the same thing, and maybe it's always accurate to your experience in that moment, but the experience changes, right?
Mhm.
Normally, when you visualize it, if you were thinking of something that is valid but not reliable, again, the average data point makes sense and it's accurate to the real situation, but there's a lot of fluctuation, especially if you're talking about a larger sample size. Obviously, the emotional state would be all the data points collected for one person, but if you, let's say, had variation in your data, maybe you had a higher standard deviation, but like the mean was pretty accurate to what you expect. I don't know. Visually, I can picture how it would apply to like a dartboard, but it's hard to think of an example.
Yeah,
Um,
that's why I think it's kind of, at least for the MCAT, and I guess for anyone listening for an MCAT purpose, because if we can't think of like a really hard example, the MCAT's not really gonna make you think of an example. But what you can absolutely have is high reliability and low validity and low accuracy. That's definitely something that can happen, like in our scale example. And kind of as long as you understand what to be looking in research, if you see anything that could impact the validity or impact the reliability, especially in a passage, note that down. I love when I'm reading a passage and I see something that's like a big red flag. They like say like, oh, they we're maybe it's about rats and they say like, oh, they didn't control for food. They let the rats eat forever. I'm like, oh, okay, that affects internal validity. Great. Or maybe they were like, oh, they use different raters, right, to measure, risk size. Oh, now that's okay, they could get different measurements each time. So maybe that's, inter-rater reliability, which is type of reliability. These sorts of things are the kind of things that we want to be watching out for in a passage. Is it holding to this validity, to this sort of reliability? And there's kind of like red flags that when you see them, you can probably bet that there's going to be a question about them, especially when it comes to research like that. So yeah, absolutely be looking out for these when you see research.
Yes. And it
Mhm.
comes back to actually an episode that we had done in the past, which
Mhm.
is how to best approach psych soc. One of the things that psych soc will ask you to do that is much more common there than in chem phys or biochem, although of course it could happen there too, is they will describe something, right, without officially saying it. Like
Mhm.
they're giving you every indication. They're pointing you pretty strongly towards a particular term or buzzword, but they're not using the word itself. They're describing it to you.
Mhm.
Okay, this happens all the time. If at any point, especially when reading psych soc, but any passage from any section, if you start to realize like, wait a minute, they're saying that this molecule is an inhibitor of an enzyme that is a substrate analog or it binds to the active site, it's like, ooh, ding ding, that sounds like something I studied. That sounds like a competitive inhibitor. That would be an example, right? If you see it described and it's reminding you of something you studied, jot it down, do something with it, keep it in mind, because usually, and again, especially so in psych soc, usually they'll be setting up a question. They've dropped some clues in there so that it's fair to ask a question about what's going on. So yeah, I love that. Keep an eye out for things like this. These are all things that can clue you into the type of research that we're dealing with. Now, if we had to kind of summarize what's going on, right? If we are approaching a random passage, okay,
Mhm.
first thing you need to do is figure out what type of study am I dealing with? Okay, is this an experiment or is this an observational study? And again, big question is, are the researchers directly, manipulating something that's going on? Like, do I have the power to go in and actually create change in whatever my research subjects or participants' lives are? It could also be, a microbial experiment. Maybe we're dealing with bacteria, or it could be like a completely inorganic situation. Did I directly change something? Am I creating some, unique experience, right? If so, experiment. If not, if I'm just looking, observational. Okay. If it's experimental, great. I think we're more comfortable with that for the most part. Identify your variables. You might get some data, in which case identify your trends using the strategies you talked about before. But again, if we're thinking, no, this is more observational, we have a lot more to consider, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
when
So
we,
this is now we've got like this different like types. Now we have, because we talked about a lot of different study types. This is when we have to think, okay, right. Are we longitudinal? Are we cross-sectional? Is this something where did we start at the cause? Did we start at the outcome? Where did we start there? Is this a cohort study versus, a case control study? Are there certain biases that they introduced in the studies? Are there certain things that could impact validity or reliability? Did they only have a sample size of 3 people versus a sample size of 1,000 people? Like, oh, did they only get from a really high performing school when they did this, class study? We want to be looking for these sorts of red flags to kind of signal, A, is there a bias? Could there be an issue with the study? Because these sorts of things I like to like take note of, because this is how we connect it to the questions, right? A lot of the times questions will, especially for an experimental passage where there's some sort of a research passage, will directly ask about those things. So you want to start anticipating, start thinking about those things before you even get there. So looking for those things while you're doing it, and that's why, and this is one thing why I'd say to a lot of people in Psych Soc, slow down when you're reading the passage. Because I know, like, on a lot of people do tend to finish Psych Soc a little bit earlier. Of all the 4 sections, I think that's probably the section that most commonly people have a little bit of time at the end. But sometimes it's really extreme. Like some people are like, yeah, I have a half hour at the end of Psych Soc. And I'm
yeah,
like, in my mind, and this is pretty extreme, if you're finishing with a half hour left, there's no excuse to kind of like not be getting a really, really good score in Psych Soc. So usually my recommendation, if people are struggling with, scoring in Psych Soc, or maybe struggling with, oh, I didn't see that in the passage, slow down when reading the passage. Like, actually go through it. There's an experimental passage. Don't skim it. Actually find the things that you're looking for. And what you'll find is you're going to be far more accurate, and it's not going to take that much more time because now you're not rereading the passage all the time. And so
yeah.
if I'm sure there's somebody out there who's like, oh, I'm struggling with Psych Social and finishing 20 minutes, half an hour earlier. I usually recommend slow down the passage, especially for these research type passages, to actually pay attention to what kind of red flags are they showing in the passage so that you can kind of get a hint for the questions you're about to see.
Yeah, especially because, and we mentioned this in our Psych Social episode, but really for most of us, we're not limited by time in Psych Social, we're limited by brain power.
Hmm.
We are exhausted. This is our last section, right? It's so hard to truly pay attention because you've just taken, right, like 5 hours combined of really hard MCAT sections, right? It's hard. You're at the end of your day. This is the end of the marathon. But because of that, especially, slow down, right? It's going to be hard to pay attention, period, because we're going to be a little more tired. If it's already hard to pay attention because we're a little more exhausted and we're reading quickly, we're gonna we're
That's a
gonna fall
recipe
for a
for
lot of
disaster.
mistakes,
Yeah.
we're gonna fall for a lot of traps. We're gonna misunderstand quite a few things. If you are working with maybe less mental energy in the tank, but you are reading slowly and carefully, you're gonna be fine. Okay, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna do very well, especially compared to your peers if they are not giving themselves adequate time. So I love that. And it really does call back to what we had talked about before. And in the note of taking full lengths and doing
Mm,
practice exams, we've got a really, really fun episode. I'm very excited to share the news.
right.
Um, for anyone who has not heard this already, we have a new AAMC exam. They call it Exam 6. There was a switch up with the naming that they did as of September of this year, 2025, where they switched the name of the free practice exam to Exam 5. Okay. And so this is now Exam 6. So there were already 6 AAMC exams, 4 that had numbers, and then 2 that were free. They took one of the free, made it 5, and then they added 6, which is brand new this year. Okay, so for all of us, or for any of us out there who might be retakers, if you took it in 2025 test cycle, you have a new exam. Brand new as of September. Hopefully we haven't taken it. Hopefully that'll be helpful as we prepare for our retake in 2026. But we are basically going to each of us take this exam and share our reactions. We're going to get a
Right.
little bit meta here.
It's going to be so much fun because a lot of people, especially a lot of the students that we work with, are kind of telling us a lot of interesting information about the exams that they're seeing and how oh, it was a little bit different from this practice exam, this practice exam. So this is kind of like an opportunity to see what is the most up-to-date version of this exam. How is it different from the exams beforehand? What can we learn or what should we be doing now that this is maybe the focus of the AAMC? A lot of things that people are talking about, like, oh, psych social is so much more like cars, like, oh, they have so much interesting application. Oh, it's all low yield material. We'll be going through the most up-to-date material that the AAMC has offered, and we'll see. Is that true? Are they only putting on low yield material? Is psych social all cars? Tune in the next episode because we will be taking the exam and giving our reactions. You won't see us actually doing the exam on podcast because we're gonna try to do it in test conditions as much as possible, at least, and then we'll kind of come in and give our reaction. So this is a kind of a really unique episode because of just kind of the news. So I'm really excited to talk about the next one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for anyone who's hearing that and being like, wow, that sounds really fun, but I don't want spoilers, we won't give spoilers.
No. We're
We
gonna
won't
give
any
overview.
specific questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be
Yeah,
mostly like, here's a reaction, here's some thoughts, and then we'll kind of visit some of these things that we hear on Reddit and hear from students, some possible myths to debunk, some trends we might be able to share. So if you haven't taken the exam, you're waiting and you're going to take it before your test, that's totally fine. This episode is still for you. So I can't wait. This is going to be a super fun one. We'll go ahead and leave it there. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night or morning or whenever we're catching you with this episode. Happy studying, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.